It's budget day, and it was a big one, as always. We're interested in what you guys have to say, so please let us know in the comments what your initial thoughts are on the budget and how it will affect you. I am delighted this evening to be able to say that I'm joined by a good friend of the show, Helena, aka No Justice MTG. Helena, how are you feeling tonight?
Yeah, I'm doing pretty good. I've had a pretty busy week last week, but I've taken it easy so far, just talking mostly budget stuff over the course of this week, and I've had a pretty good day so far, so looking forward to the show.
Of course, we have lots to talk about. It's the day that we've all been waiting for. After months of speculation, rumours, Chancellor Rachel Reeves left Number 11 this morning with her famous red box and delivered her first budget as Chancellor to the House of Commons. Here are some of the key takeaways. The Chancellor announced the single biggest rise in taxes since 1993, announcing tax increases worth £40 billion. Despite promising there will be no return to austerity and claiming to have kept that promise, a 2% annual savings target was announced for every government department. Is this just austerity under another name? The government have announced that they will be publishing the Get Britain Working white paper and will be investing £240 million into trialling new ways to get people back into work and vowing to keep planned reforms to welfare. And while the budget has no mention of wealth taxes on the super rich or the two-child benefit cap, how many times do you think the autumn budget mentions poverty? Of course, there is so much more to unpack from this budget, and we'll barely touch the surface this evening. I will say that there are some things on the surface that look quite good too. I mean, £22 billion extra for the NHS, an increase in minimum wage, tripling of investments for breakfast clubs, a slight increase in the windfall tax on energy companies, all very welcome. But unfortunately, we don't have time to go through the entire thing with a fine-tooth comb, so we're just going to look at some of the measures announced today. Before we get into some of the details, the Chancellor opened her speech today with a scathing attack on the previous government's record. Let's take a look.
The Office for Budget Responsibility have published their own review of the circumstances around the spring budget forecast. They say that the previous government, and I quote, did not provide the OBR with all the information to them. And had they known about these undisclosed pressures that have since come to light, then their spring budget forecast for spending would have been, and I quote again, materially different. Let me be clear. That means any comparison between today's forecast and the OBR's March forecast is false. Because the party opposite hid the reality of their public spending plans. Yet, at the very same budget, they made another £10 billion worth of cuts to national insurance. It was the height of irresponsibility, and they knew it, because they had run out of road and they called an election to avoid making difficult choices.
Any comparison between today's forecast and the OBR's March forecast is false, according to Rachel Reeves. Many right-wing commentators are already highlighting the differences in growth projections, and the Office for Budget Responsibility themselves shared this graph on Twitter earlier. The growth in GDP predicted in March is in yellow, and the prediction based on today's budget is in blue. Now, while there is an increase in 24 and 25, after that, it is predicting less growth, not more. So, is the Chancellor right? Is it fair to argue that these comparisons are false? And if so, who's to blame for that? The Tories or the Labour Party? After all, the rules have changed since the spring. In fact, changes to fiscal rules have opened the door to a further £50 billion for spending by Rachel Reeves. Is it even a level playing field? Helena, what are your thoughts on this scathing attack and Rachel Reeves' opening to her budget?
Well, I think broadly we should be looking towards any projections as again, only being projections. We can't really have a crystal ball in which we can look into the in which we can look into the future and say, well, this is definitely how much growth that we're going to get, right? So I think that any comparison that is only based upon the projections of the OBR, which, as I've been reading through their entire report regarding the budget today, as far as I'm concerned, is entirely encapsulated by monetarist groupthink and treasury brain rot. So at the end of the day, we are looking at what are estimations, to be true, right? These are just estimations. And the issue, of course, is that a lot of the OBR's projections in the March budget were based upon things that they weren't told by the Conservatives during the budget that were uncovered as part of the £22 billion black hole. Now, this isn't the entirety of the black hole, nor is it even a majority, it's a very small amount of it. But even so, these are all things that were covered up by the previous government, hence why they're called an early election, as per many reasons for things that they covered up that they didn't want to have to deal with in government. However, I also do think that whilst this budget is not as bad as you'd get from a conservative government, is this a pro growth government? Are we going to be seeing the kind of growth that we need to have for the Labour Party to reach anywhere near the central mission that they had? Remember, they had 5 missions running into the election. Their central mission was having the highest sustained growth in the G7. Now, regardless of what the projections might or might not be, this is not the budget for this. This is not the budget for this. There may be some expansionary policies for investment, but those expansionary policies are pretty short currently of what we really need to be looking at in terms of investment that's going to lead to a lot of growth. And on top of that, a lot of the departmental budgets are going to require a lot more money than they actually have to see growth within communities rather than just overall. Remember, there's a difference between a lot of growth coming from new commodity production and investment in business that creates more economic activity and just, I don't know, a rise in house prices or a rise in the value of financial instruments. Where if we trade a bunch of financial instruments between each other because we have a thriving financial sector, that may seem to increase the overall growth level, but is that actually filtering down to the regular person on the street? Now, a lot of figures that I've seen, the IFS have just shared today coming out from the OBR, shows that overall household expenditure and household wealth is only increasing by 0.1% ahead of what it would be over the previous parliament. Again, just a projection, but it just shows you that the actual impact that's going to be felt on the regular people on the ground are going to feel is that not that much better than the biggest dropping living standards since the Napoleonic Wars that we had over the previous parliament. So the jury is still out at time of recording, but is this budget actually going to be hitting the mark? I don't think so.
No. And I think, it's important that we consider how the average person on the street is going to be affected by this, like you allude to, because people are struggling, right? We've had 14 years of Tory austerity. We've got a cost of living crisis. We've got energy bills through the roof, and people are struggling. But we are only going to be able to understand sort of exactly how it's going to affect people in due course. So I suppose for that, we need to wait and see. But let's move on to some of the detail that was included in today's budget. So Chancellor Rachel Reeves has announced tax increases worth £40 billion this afternoon, marking the single biggest rise in taxes from any UK budget since 1993. Now, while Labour kept their manifesto promise to not increase VAT, national insurance, or income tax increases for working people, as expected, they did decide to increase employer contributions to national insurance by 1.2 percentage points, while also lowering the secondary threshold from £9,100 to £5,000, a move that the Chancellor says will raise £25 billion. Capital gains tax will also be increased from 10% to 18%, and the higher rate will see an increase from 20% to 24%. Reeves also announced a flat rate duty on vaping liquid, increases in tobacco duty, and air passenger duty on private jet use being increased by 50%, much to the dismay of some on the opposing benches. She also announced the much-anticipated VAT on private school fees, which will be introduced from January, slightly earlier than some of those private schools were expecting, and the scrapping of the non-dom tax scheme. However, Reeves was quick to add that they will be replacing this scheme with a new residence-based system. Helena, a lot to unpack. What are your initial thoughts on Labour's tax plans that have been introduced today?
So, with regards to this, £40 billion of tax increases, which is going to be projected by the end of the parliament. It's the projected number of the projected amount of tax increases by the end of the parliament. The first year is going to be around 36 billion, and that's going to increase to 40 billion by the end of the parliament. Is one of the biggest increases in tax we've seen in a single budget in many, many years and decades, potentially, right? It is a large increase in the overall responsibility of paying tax. I don't like the term tax burden. People are using it, so I'm trying to steer away from it. But the overall responsibility of paying tax within our society is going up, both in real terms and as a percentage of GDP, to one of the highest on record. Now, this is in line with most countries in Europe that are seeing overall increases in tax, especially to be able to deal with a lot of the fiscal expansion that we saw over the pandemic, to be able to keep people in work, or to be able to pay for people to not be in work whilst they were trying to be in lockdown. So that's something that we're seeing across the Western world. So this is normal. This is a kind of normal thing to do. It's also worth taking into account this is within the context of overall the fact that taxes have gone down since 2010 to 2019, only to just slightly rise under the Boris Johnson administration to be able to pay for a lot of public works and a lot of public sector increases in spending that we saw under the Boris Johnson administration, in a kind of departure from the Osborne and Cameron era. But in context, this 40 billion is only trying to get us to the point at which we have the level of public services that we had before David Cameron and George Osborne took an absolute wrecking ball to the public realm during the coalition government and beyond. So, whilst it is a large number in relativity, it's a large number relative to previous budgets, right? Is it enough to actually fix all of the problems? To what Keir Starmer would say in his buzz phrase that's been kind of the cornerstone of a lot of Labour Party messaging on this, to fix the foundations? I don't think so. I don't think it's really going to be enough when we are seeing that this is coming alongside some difficult decisions being made in some departments. Now, of course, I'm glad to see that local authorities are seeing a 10% rise in the amount of money that they're getting. They've been really beleaguered with 40% cuts since 2010. But there are plenty of other departments, I think it's 6 or 7 departments, are all seeing reductions in real term spending, including the Home Office and DEFRA and many other departments, which do need this money as well. So there is going to be there is scope for raising so much more, right? There is scope for raising so much more tax. The fact that they're raising capital gains, but they're not equalizing it with income tax, which they should be doing, for two
Mhm.
reasons, for two main reasons. First of all, it's just unfair. It's unfair that people who work for a living, who actually do productive work and could contribute to society, pay more in tax than those who sit on their ass and make money off of money, who make money off of assets, who actually do no work in producing new commodities. None of these people who pay capital gains tax are adding anything new and creating any economic growth. It's also silly for economic reasons, right? Given the turning commodities into money plus the same commodities plus money, like MCM Prime, is not economically productive. Working is economically productive, and that creates growth. Taxation is a way of creating an incentive or a disincentive. If you tax something more, it's a disincentive. If you tax it less, it's an incentive. And what they are doing by having higher taxation on productive work and lower taxation on unproductive speculation is incentivizing people to do the latter rather than the former. When, if your central mission is the highest sustained growth in the G7, you want to incentivize people to work hard and be productive, which means we need to at least equalize them, if not have capital gains taxed more than we do income, in my opinion.
Mhm. No, I completely agree, and like you say, it's blatantly unfair. The other arguments are important, but from a fairness point of view, it's wrong. On taxes as well, obviously the government have committed to upholding the triple lock on pensions, and there is going to be an increase in what pensioners are receiving. However, they've not gotten rid of the freeze on the income tax threshold. Now, their argument is that obviously what they're doing is they're keeping a conservative policy and they're not going to extend it, which is a great thing. It's not going to be extended. But it does mean that some pensioners come 2027 are actually going to be earning so much that they'll be paying taxes on their pensions where they weren't before. How can that be fair?
I mean, I think that given that fiscal drag was baked into Conservative spending plans before, I think you can't really blame the Labour government for continuing that, given the overall need for more taxation. I think that whilst it's right to focus on the rich needing to pay more in tax, right, we need to focus on the rich paying more in tax, and that will happen from private school fees taxation and non-dom taxation. And when we look at the increase in capital gains tax, for example, broadly, everyone needs to be paying more tax. In my opinion, we all need to be paying more tax, and a very slight increase in tax, especially for pensioners who are protected from the cost of living crisis somewhat by seeing their incomes rise with inflation where wages are not rising with inflation. You know, having some of that recouped by the exchequer at the very least to ensure that taxation is fair across both of those. I think that's not necessarily too unreasonable, but of course,
Mhm.
there is a choice that's been made here. If we'd have equalized capital gain tax with income tax, introduced a wealth tax, we could get rid of fiscal drags. And regardless of whether you think that that's a good thing economically, politically, it would be incredibly well received by the electorate, given that their whole shtick is ensuring that we keep the tax burden as low as possible on working people, which is
Mhm.
who pays PAYE, which is where the taxation, where the fiscal drag is being applied, a tax on working people. If you say, we're going to do this really great thing for you where we're going to ensure that we're not subjecting you to fiscal drag and also we're taxing the rich people to pay for it, that's a choice they could make. And I'm sure the electorate would be very receptive to it in a way that they probably won't be to see, for example, their potential pension get taxed from the state pension, given that it's just risen with a triple lock.
But Rachel Reeves had an opportunity today to introduce a wealth tax, and to introduce one on assets over 10 million, which isn't going to affect the average working person. So, I mean, what do you suppose is the reason that she didn't do that? Is it due to the fact that they've now got a lot of billionaire donors that are putting money into the Labour Party who would obviously be caught with that sort of tax, or do you think there's another reason for it?
I mean, it's just the same reason as to why their original potential plans, right? The things that were floated previously for a tax on private equity bosses making money and taxing it like income rather than capital gains because it's made from as somebody who is speculating on the value of our economy or the value of markets, right? Like these people were going to be have their income as private equity bosses taxed like they were regular workers, except that was junked, sorry, as a policy. And you look at the people who fund Labour Together, the think tank who set most of Labour policy, a bunch of these people all have their fingers in the private equity pie. Is there
Mhm.
any reason why this tax has been junked, even though they had plans for it before, given who funds Labour Together? And then on top of that, all of these rich people would obviously be people who would end up seeing a wealth tax. I don't think Wahid Ali really wants to see any level of taxation. A lack of a wealth tax is certainly something that is more likely to happen, or more like the lack of it is more likely to happen. So the actual tax itself is less likely to happen if, I don't know, members of the cabinet have close financial links to Lord Wahid Ali, for example. I'm not saying this is a bribe. I'm not saying that he said, if I give you this expensive piece of clothing for your wife, you won't tax me anymore. I'm not saying that happens, but it certainly
Mhm.
influences who you think your taxation policy is for.
Yeah, of course. I'd like to move on and talk a little bit about austerity. Rachel Reeves has promised that we would not see a return to austerity. Yet the budget sets out a 2% productivity, efficiencies, and savings target for government departments, and has formally launched the Office for Value for Money to realise benefits from every pound of public spending. Now, is this part of the strict fiscal rules that we've heard so much about? Deputy Leader of the Green Party, Zach Polanski, took to Twitter to say this. He said, Rachel Reeves centres reducing the deficit as part of her plans. Let's be really clear about this. One, that's literally austerity. Welcome back, Cameron and Osborne. And two, a so called surplus budget would just mean that there is less money being spent in our economy. So Helena, what do you reckon? Is it a sensible target to have on these government departments, or is it just austerity via the back door?
Now, there are lots of different definitions of austerity that get touted around by people. I know that people are they're very forthright in believing their definition of austerity is true. Now, if you take the dictionary definition, like austerity is when you either raise taxes or cut spending to reduce the deficit. And this is a deficit reduction budget. Let's be real. There are plenty of shades of austerity here, and I think I would agree with Zach Polanski in at least part of what he's saying there. And especially, whether or not you want to use the words to define it. What he's absolutely right is that running a surplus means less money on the other side of the ledger, which is private spending in the economy. You want to get growth, you want money in people's hands to be able to spend there. I know that all of the monetarist group think of the OBR as saying, oh, well, this means inflation is going to be higher because of all of these fiscally expansionary measures. Well, it's one of the basic parts of kind of Keynesian economics is that demand driven stimulus increases the supply in response, right? So supply will increase to be able to meet the new demand rather than just raising prices. That is a very monetarist view, a very neoliberal view of how public spending impacts whether or not we have inflation. But regardless, the idea of aiming specifically for a budget surplus was something that was recommended to the Labour government by the Resolution Foundation, another one of the myriad think tanks who is helping them craft policy. It's not just the Tories who rely on think tanks, or the Labour think tanks may be nicer, but it is still something that's happening outside of public support for policies and is being done technocratically by people behind the scenes who have access to power. And I obviously have very many issues with this. I also have an issue that I think the policy is bad. I don't think you should be running a surplus, right? Running a deficit is how we would stimulate growth. Again, to achieve the central mission of the highest sustained growth in the G7, why would you run a surplus? The only reason Tony Blair managed to run a surplus in the 2000s is because a lot of the government debt was being kept off the balance sheet because it was PFI debt and wasn't being issued bonds, for example. Now, I know that Rachel Reeves isn't doing that at time of recording, but what this still means is that by aiming for a budget surplus, however many years down the line, we are looking at an overall level of deficit reduction. And that is before we even look at a bunch of departments that are seeing lots of attempted efficiency savings. Now, you may say efficiency savings isn't actually austerity. The budgets are still saying are being moved around, so some get cuts, some get increases in spending. But let's be real. If there was loads of efficiency savings to be found in the public sector, given this was the central theme of the Osborne and Cameron governments of saying, no, 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 we're not doing austerity. We're not getting rid of your NHS. The literal phrase that was on the billboards that David Cameron campaigned on in 2010 was, I'll cut the deficit, I won't cut the NHS. When, of course, the NHS budget reduced as a percentage of GDP. I'm not saying that's going to happen now, but that's what happened under David Cameron. And the argument they gave was, well, we can have our budgets frozen in nominal terms, or our budgets can be cut slightly because this won't impact service provision. All this will do is force these bloated and overmanaged, all of these departments that have too many staff and not enough productivity, right? All of these bloated departments will be able to cut back and become more efficient. Unfortunately, that was a load of bollocks. It was a load of bullshit. Because actually, we had a really efficient healthcare service. We had a really efficient education service. No matter what many right wingers tell you about all this spending we have on diversity managers, which is a tiny proportion of our public expenditure, like 0.005% of the NHS budget is spent on diversity, for example. They always tell you that there's loads of fat to trim. And the answer is that it wasn't there. It wasn't there, and all we got was a massive drop in service provision over the coalition government when David Cameron was Prime Minister and when George Osborne was Chancellor. And if the Conservative Party, like the supposed masters of fiscal probity, who would absolutely find these efficiency savings if they were there, if they couldn't find efficiency savings, what makes you think that Rachel Reeves and co are going to find them too? I find that very difficult to believe.
Yeah, of course. And I mean, maybe I've missed something today, but there was a lot of talk in the lead up to the budget about difficult decisions and, and tough choices that needing to be made. And from what I can make out, and forgive me, I'm no economist, I'm no expert when it comes to, economics and finances. However, there are lots of choices that have been made that I wouldn't have made. And there are lots of choices that could have been made that I think would have generated a lot more to the public purse and would have meant that the richer paid a little bit more and the poorest, got off a little bit, a little bit more than they are in this case. Um, but what would you say is the sort of the tough decisions that they were referring to? Because it feels I don't wanna say it feels tame because it doesn't, and people are still gonna get hit by some of these decisions that have been made today. But it feels almost as if they've over-egged how bad it's going to be, and then gone a bit sort of middle of the road. One of our producers actually messaged me and was like, "Can you try and make this a little bit more exciting tonight, please?" And Rachel Reeves is doing. Um, I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
I think the budget is less bad than I was expecting. Commenters, when we were watching the announcement live, thought, well, it wasn't as bad as we expected. Lots to criticize. There's some good, some bad, some evil, some poor choices, right? But it's not the massive slashing budget that I was expecting. There's a lot more tax rises than I was expecting, at the very least. But there are choices that they've made that they didn't need to make. For example, let's take the climate, a really important thing that we all understand. And one of their key things that was mentioned in Keir Starmer's speech that he gave yesterday about fixing the foundations was that we should be fixing the foundations, quote unquote, by increasing the price that we pay for buses. Oh, but the Tories only funded it to a certain period. It was only hundreds of millions of pounds to fund the £2 bus fare cap. And increasing that to £3 saves such a little amount of money. And it's not only affecting the poorest in society by who mostly take buses, right? It's mostly poor people who take buses. I only take buses. I make 20,000 something pounds a year as self-employed, right? We get buses all the time. That's really going to affect the amount I spend on transport over the course of the entire year. And that apparently, when they run into the election, they said, oh, well, these are the broadest shoulders who are going to have to be basing things on. What? By cutting the winter fuel allowance for people who are just above the level for pension credit and making poor people pay more for the bus. Which is doubly stupid. First of all, because it's bad for optics. If you want to get re-elected, maybe don't piss off people who genuinely are going to interact with this immediately. It's something that you see in your pay packet, right? I was speaking to my friend. We were playing some games of Magic the Gathering in the pub today. And he asked me, what am I going to notice from this budget outside of the increase in the bus fare? It's really cut through with the electorate and it's making people really think the Labour Party have done a bad job with this particular policy because it affects them specifically. And I was like, well, there's not much else there. So I've done okay in messaging on this outside of the bus fare.
Mhm.
But on top of this, they're freezing fuel duty on cars
Yes.
whilst taking demand away from public transport by making it more expensive and therefore reducing the overall people who are going to be able to afford or are going to want to. We should be
Mm.
incentivizing public transport, making it cheaper, and instead we're freezing fuel duty for fucking motorists who are the ones who we need to be trying to incentivize to not do what they're doing.
Yeah.
If we'd have increased fuel duty by 5p, for example, that could have raised £3 billion. That's, or £3.1 billion. That is very similar to the total cost of every single bus journey in England combined over the
Mhm.
course of the previous year. If we increased fuel duty on cars, we could literally almost make bus travel entirely free in this country. Imagine how that would change people's behaviours. Now, you'd have to raise taxes to compensate later as people drove less and paid less in fuel, but it'd be better for the climate. This is a ridiculous choice that
Yeah.
impacts the poor, makes Labour more hated, and is terrible for the climate.
But it was odd because when she announced that particular policy, the way that she began, I mean, I was shocked that she made that decision because it sounded as though she was going to increase fuel duty. She was talking as if she was going to, and then it was almost like a got ya sort of moment when she was like, "No, we're not. We're going to freeze it." And don't get me wrong, as a motorist, there's a part of me that's like, "Well, no complaints," because at least my fuel's not going to go up in price. But equally, like you say, for an extra 5p, with the amount of money that could be raised, but then couple that with the bus fare policy, and it's just backwards. Because actually, the poorest in society are the people that aren't driving. They are the people that are getting the bus to work, because they can't afford to run a car. So an extra 5p for someone that can afford to run a car compared to an extra pound for someone who is relying on public transport, who is already often someone that is going to be financially worse off. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't. It's not like it's a choice that they had to make, because if they don't make those decisions, then the amount of money that's going to be lost is too much. There's no logic behind that decision, and it feels like it's just another opportunity for the Labour Party to stick two fingers up at working people.
As another thing as well on top of this is that when they initially cut the tax on fuel duty and then froze it, it literally did not reduce the price of fuel. Dan Needle, who is a tax researcher, did a really good bit on this, right? The thing that sets prices in your economy is the intersection of the supply-demand curve, right? If the supply of fuel remains the same and the demand remains the same, the price point will be where that curve intersects. If you decrease the tax on this, do you think that the people who have control of this, the petrochemical industry, do you think they're going to be reducing the price of fuel, or do you think they're going to keep the price the same, again, where the supply demand curve intersects? No, they didn't reduce the price of fuel, they just made more profit. They just made more profit because people were willing to pay that price already, so why reduce the price? The original cut, all it did was give money from the state to the petrochemical industry. It saved nobody any money on their actual fuel. It's a silly policy. It should never have happened in the first place. And the continuation of it is asinine as fuck, as far as I'm concerned.
No, completely agree. Now, before we move on, I just want to say, if you like what we do, then please make sure you hit the like button. Obviously, it helps with the algorithm, and it's really helpful for us to get our content out there. Also, if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe. Like I say, share our content. All of us at Turn Left are still completely voluntary. And as you know, there are 5 of us working on screen and behind the scenes to bring you up-to-date content on a regular basis. But it is difficult. We've got jobs that we have to work so that we can survive in a cost of living crisis. Of course, we'd love to be able to dedicate even more time to Turn Left, and you can help us do that, either with regular financial support or simply a one-off donation. And you can do that by going to turnleftmedia.co.uk/support. No matter how you choose to support us, your support is always appreciated. Please only give what you can afford. A like and a share is just as valuable to us. Let's look at some comments. Let's see what you guys are saying about the budget today. FSM is the dog. The OBR is there to give cover for austerity. Yeah, and they've been pushed around and accused of being used as a political football again. Have the OBR? Well, the government have been accused of using the OBR as a political football. Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think. Oh, okay. I was just going to say, I think that we, like Helena referred to earlier, we do have to sort of take the projections as projections, and we've got to remember that there are more budgets to come in this government as well. They're every year if we don't have statements in between, and it wouldn't surprise me if the government changed their mind on some of the decisions that they've made today. So no austerity except for the disabled, but they're not classed as people by Labour or the Tories. The discrimination and the work capability assessment changes brings in, the discrimination that the work capability assessment changes bring in are very similar to what they lost in the High Courts. Yeah, and we're going to come on to that one in a moment, Serp. So I'll park that one there for now. Edward Sexby, hi again. Anyway, Helena is knocking it out of the park here. Helena always does knock it out of the park. That's why we're always pleased to have her on the show whenever we can. Fliff McLaren, my pension is half the minimum wage. I can't say any more to that. It's shocking. I worry about pensioners at the moment, actually, and I know that there's a lot of discourse around whether or not we should feel sorry for them. But the winter fuel allowance is still the government are going ahead with the means testing for that. Age UK have predicted that that's going to put 2 million pensioners into fuel poverty. Roughly 1 million of those are eligible to claim pension credits. But if they don't claim them, and I think the government are counting on the fact that they won't, then they are still going to suffer as a result. Like I mentioned before, those who are on the pension who are not currently paying tax, come 2027, you're going to be paying a little bit in tax on there as well. And while I understand some of the arguments that Helena was making earlier, I do think that when the government could just introduce a wealth tax and then pensioners and vulnerable people and the poorest in society wouldn't have to pay. I think that I do have a bit of sympathy for those who are going to end up paying a bit more. Jacqueline, Labour aren't doing anything that means they could lose their corporate funding. Exactly. And that is a big takeaway from this budget. I mean, we knew it was going to happen as soon as we found out prior to the budget and following the election where some of the money was coming from. I mean, when you've got a party that's taking millions of pounds from offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, of course they are not going to introduce changes to the economy that are going to harm those people. Again, like Helena said earlier, not saying that they're taking bribes. However, when you've got people donating huge amounts of money, you're going to want to keep those people happy. So let's move on. In her budget speech, Chancellor Rachel Reeves announced plans to release Labour's Get Britain Working white paper, with plans to invest £240 million into trialling new ways to get people back into work. However, some of Labour's plans to get people working again involve, as was alluded to in the comments, going full steam ahead with the previous government's controversial plans to reform welfare and the way in which work capability assessments are carried out. On welfare, the published budget document reads, the government is reforming its approach to welfare, including setting a new welfare cap for 2029 to 30, with strengthened accountability to support spending control and ensure that welfare spending is sustainable in the medium term. Fraud and error in the welfare system costs the government almost £10 billion a year. The government is cracking down on this with a package of measures saving £4.3 billion in 2029 to 2030. The government will set out reforms to health and disability benefits early in 2025 to ensure the system supports people who can work to remain in or start employment in a way that is fair and fiscally sustainable. Once again, Starmer's changed Labour Party is going after some of the most vulnerable people in society. Back in April, the Big Issue reported that the Tories' proposed changes to the work capability assessment would strip health-related benefits from over 450,000 people. Reacting to the announcement to push ahead with these plans, Green MP Sian Berry tweeted, Rachel Reeves and Liz Kendall have made a poor decision sticking with Conservative plans to change the work capability assessment. As the OBR says, cutting £260 from incomes of the sick and disabled is not likely to help them into work. I mean, do Labour just hate people on benefits as much as the last lot? Or are they still trying to appeal to a certain type of voter? I mean, Helena, why are Labour content on fucking over vulnerable people?
I mean, this is why big part of the rhetoric in the run up to the election, and of course post election, has been part of the discourse all week on the definition, is that they've been talking about working people. Now, ostensibly, this is about a distinction between those who make their money from working and those who make their money from assets. But what it does as an ancillary rhetorical strategy is make a distinction between those who can work and those who can't. But that's not how people in the public view it. The people in the public view it as those who do work and those who refuse to work. There is still this pretty big lie, let's be real, a very kind of pervasive lie that spreads through society that somehow everybody who is disabled is faking it, or they shouldn't be on benefits, or somehow their benefits are too high, or they're a drain on the welfare state, and they're people who could be working but aren't, despite the fact that these people have been signed off by medical professionals. Do I think that Labour are somehow kind of maliciously trying to attack disabled people? I don't think they really think that far ahead or even care. I think they're such mindless automatons. I don't think that they're as malicious as the Conservative Party on this. But what I do think that they think they're doing is employing an electoral strategy to try and get re-elected off of the back of being seen as being the people who got people off welfare. It's red meat. It's a red meat policy to hand out out to all of these people who buy into this falsehood that everybody who is off work sick is somehow a scrounger. It's all very useless eaters rhetoric, isn't it? They should be in work. Everybody should have the dignity of work. Work sets you free. Like, this rhetoric is really disgusting, and it carries on from the Conservatives, not just rhetorically, but in fucking policy. Like, we all, us here on the left, when we were getting outraged in the 2010s, one of the main targets of our ire was Ian Duncan Smith, who was in the Department for Work and Pensions during the coalition government. And his reign of terror on the disabled led to the Conservative government being described by a United Nations envoy as having violated the human rights of the disabled. That's what happened under the Conservative government. And the policies, the change to the work capability assessment again, is something that was pushed to the Conservative government by a think tank, ironically called the Centre for Social Justice, that Mel Stride took their policy platform and then put it into government, which they were going to do before the election that Labour are now continuing. Guess who set up the Centre for Social Justice? None other than Ian Duncan Bloody Smith. It's like nothing has changed. Of course, Liz Kendall, the Secretary of State for the DWP, is the one spearheading this. Someone so monumentally dislikable that even with the backing of the Morgan McSweeney clan in the background in the 2015 leadership election, who managed to scrounge a way to get an endorsement from The Sun too, just shows you how little she was actually liked by anybody who has any connections to the Labour movement more broadly, only got 4%, is because the things that she believes are quite frankly revolting. And the fact that they think that it's worth saving what little money they are going to save in the welfare budget by essentially penalising disabled people. Again, nobody says is going to get them back into work. We cut loads of benefits from people, cut loads of welfare payments from the unemployed and the disabled during the coalition government. Does that decrease the number of people who are off with disability? No. You know what would decrease the amount of people who are off work with disability? Investment in the NHS. Now, this is something that they have said they're going to do on a very kind of small scale, but to fix the foundations, quote unquote, as they say they want to do, of the NHS and to get it back on its feet and fit for the future, the canards that they throw around when talking about NHS policy, it's going to require getting rid of all of the austerity, all of the privatisation that's been hammered into the NHS, and get these people who are ill, who need help, who need medical treatment, whether it is therapy, whether it is physical treatment for their disability, or whatever it is, to try and get them back into work or get them fit to work. Is going to have to come from an increase in the NHS budget and an increase in provision to get these people off the giant waiting lists that started because of austerity in the first place.
But it's
Which,
not
of
just
course, yeah,
it's not just
go for it.
disabled people and the long-term sick that are being fucked over by this. It's the people that care for them as well. I mean, the government have announced some leeway for carers, so those receiving carers allowance will now be able to earn slightly more than what they could previously earn before they reach a cliff edge and then don't get the carers allowance, which is great if you're somebody that cares for a friend or a family member and also is able to work. But there's nothing in this budget for those carers who are unable to work because they are caring full-time. There's no help for them. So not only are they fucking over the people with disabilities, but the people that look after them and are unable to work because they are carers are also going to get no extra support as well.
And it shows you, no matter how much they try and say that they're turning the page on the previous government, so much neoliberal orthodoxy and ideology underpins a lot of the beliefs and the way in which they craft policy. The idea that we shouldn't be thinking about the holistic nature of how this is going to affect human flourishing and human well-being in our society. It's, are these economic units performing in such a way as best benefits the red line? Because if the red line goes up, the world is more good there. And that fundamental philosophy underlines all of their policy platform. In some ways, it leads to positive outcomes like investment in the supply side, which will increase growth and increase the prosperity for everybody. But obviously, that comes with the corollary, which is that you attack those who are economically inactive. I mean, economically inactive in a bad way, not in a good way, like landlords or private investors or anybody like that. No, they're economically inactive in a very good way because they turn their money into more money while sitting on their asses. They're people who are unable to work because they are too sick or because they are looking after someone who is too sick. They're not accounted for. They don't matter. They're scroungers. They're not people who are relevant to our society because they're not quote unquote working people. It's pathetic.
Yeah, completely agree. Now, before we finish, I want to talk about what was missing. We've touched on some of it already. While watching the budget today, I noticed no mention at all of the two-child benefit cap. Now, I'm not really surprised about that, given that the Labour Party suspended 7 of its MPs during the vote on the King's Speech after they voted on a motion to scrap the cap. But the excuse that Labour gave at the time, while acknowledging the huge impact scrapping the cap would have on child poverty and alleviating it, the reaction at the time was to say that they had other plans to tackle child poverty, and so scrapping the two-child benefit cap wasn't the solution. In fact, I'm sure I remember them saying at the time that there will be measures in the budget that would alleviate child poverty, and therefore there'd be no need at all to look at scrapping the two-child benefit cap. But here's the thing. I had a look through the documentation that came out today surrounding the autumn budget, and I want you to guess how many times the phrase child poverty appears in that documentation. Because the government estimate that 4.3 million children, that's 30% of children in the UK, are currently living in poverty. And in the autumn budget, the phrase child poverty appears a grand total of once. The government is helping low-income households on universal credit by allowing them to pay off their debts over a longer time frame and keep more of their UC each month. The government is creating a new fair repayment rate which caps debt repayments made through universal credit at 15% of the standard allowance. This will benefit around 1.2 million households as they will keep more of their universal credit awards each month, with households expected to be better off by £420 a year on average. Around 700,000 of the poorest families with children will benefit as a result of this change, supporting the government's ambition to tackle child poverty. Well, they say it's supporting the government's ambition to tackle child poverty, but that is the only time that the phrase child poverty appears in the budget documentation, and one of only 3 times that you will read the word poverty, full stop. In a country where the rich continue to get richer, and where the government refuse to impose a wealth tax, while children living in poverty make up almost a third of all the children in the UK, and they mention it once in their flagship budget, can we really say that Starmer's Labour Party has our best interests at heart? Helena, what are your thoughts on that one?
I mean, at the end of the day, this is a government that doesn't care about this stuff. Like, let's be real. They say, right, the response that you got as well when they said, oh, well, what about the two-child benefit cap? Is they say, oh, no, well, we're going to have a child poverty task force. Okay, so you're going to have a quango that you're going to spend all this money on, that you're going to invest all of this time and energy in, that's not actually going to reduce child poverty until they've convened for 9 months or whatever it is to devise all these strategies that may theoretically reduce child poverty in the future. Obviously, this isn't mentioned in the budget either. And they'll almost certainly come back and say, yeah, the two-child benefit cap's keeping hundreds of thousands of children in poverty completely unnecessarily. And I think they'll just ignore it. They'll just ignore it rather than U-turn like they should, because the policy is popular, because people don't understand statecraft in this country, because of course they've got too much time on their hands being busy having to deal with all of the problems of life rather than having to worry about things like how the statecraft is. That's what politicians are supposed to do, to tell people how to run the country. You're supposed to speak to people and say, well, actually, this would be really good for society because we have a low birth rate. Child poverty is bad. It does cost the state more to have to educate these children who might be more likely to act out at school or to deal with their health problems that arise from growing up in poverty, or in fact the lower productivity with them growing up in a poorer household. But no, passing these messages is too hard. Let's just buy into the rhetoric that already exists. And on top of that, the only mention of child poverty, as you say, is about this change in how much debt that you have to repay. It's fine though. I know that you're laden with loads of debt, people on universal credit, some of those poorest people in the country. I know you're laden with debt. We're not going to alleviate you of the actual debt itself or increase your payments so it doesn't really matter that you're paying the debt back or you'll be able to pay the debt back quicker. No, we're just going to cap the rate at which you repay it. You'll still be burdened by it. You'll still be a cloud hanging over your head, but at the very least you'll repay it slower. Will that actually broadly affect a lot of child poverty? I really do not think so. But again, the children in poverty, are they working people? I don't think so. So why should the Labour government care?
Yeah. It's I've no words. You've put it fantastically, as you always do, and I am sure, Helena, that we could go on and on and on about this budget. However, unfortunately, this is all that we have time for tonight. Of course, as always, I want to say a huge thank you to Helena, also known as No Justice MTG. If you don't follow her, go and do so now. Thanks, Helena, for joining us this evening, and as always, a huge thank you to all of you watching at home. Remember, if you wish to support Turn Left, you can do so by going to turnleftmedia.co.uk/support. We will be back on Friday, but until then, I'm Callum Taylor, aka Polity_Cal. Thank you and good night.
Support independent media, support social justice that's there on social media. Thank you. Turn Left.